giving two presentations we are looking forward to. We will start with Felix, and Felix is a professor in with specialized in environmental humanities and climate change archaeology. He is at Aarhus University in Denmark, and he's head of a great European Research Council research project. And also the leader of the Center for Environmental Humanities at Aarhus University. And but he also has a keen interest in education, and has actually also developed educational material, and he's very interested in how this new condition of the Anthropocene and the deep history can and should influence our educational system. I will not say anything more because I will leave the rest to you, Felix. The title of your presentation, The Mandate of the Anthropocene and the Collapse of Disciplinary Boundaries in Education. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen. Oh, yeah.
Have you turned on the sound, Felix?
Let's see. I have, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds good. But can you see?
We will see Mark. Are you with us? Because we have difficulties hearing Felix.
Yes, I'm here. What's the difficulties? I should have spotlighted Felix, so everybody should be able to see him. We can't hear you. They can't hear you, Felix, they say.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Most people are nodding.
Most people can. Martin just wrote he can't. Oh, he says we can hear you. Okay, so everybody seems to hear and see you just fine.
Okay, so I'll just try sharing my screen once more. Yeah, and if somebody could just confirm that you're seeing my PowerPoint show and not my presenter view, that'd be appreciated.
Yes.
Jesper is nodding.
We are in presenter view.
Are you? Okay. Yeah. Better?
Yes, better.
Much better.
Brilliant. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for having me at this exciting conference. You can see the title of my presentation here, but I think in some ways it should probably have been The Mandate of the Anthropocene and the Necessary Collapse of Disciplinary Boundaries in Education, because that is the argument that I'll try to make in the next 30 minutes or so. I also want to start by declaring my colors. I am not per se an education researcher, but I am a practicing tertiary education practitioner. And it is really through my research that is concerned with human-environment relations across deep time that I've arrived at a point where I've become intensely interested in the institutional structures and contents of education, on the one hand, at the tertiary level, so at university, but also at secondary and primary education levels, and not least at the interface between formal and informal education platforms, especially museums. So that's what I'm going to focus about. And this is both the structure and the main take-home message of my presentation. So if you want to hop out into another session, just hang on for this slide. The foundation of my perspective rests in Dipesh Chakrabarty's important texts from 2008, 2014, and 2018, where he makes an argument for conjoined histories of climate and culture. And this is the foundation for a new disciplinary mandate of the Anthropocene. And to make this more concrete, I will give you a little rundown of archaeology and its Anthropocene entanglements as a discipline, just to make the point that a discipline such as archaeology, but the same holds true of history and many other disciplines within the sciences, are not politically neutral. They serve notions of progress. They are steeped in what you could call conceptual colonialism. So far for the critique. But to be productive in this debate, we can draw on recent research in both literature studies, socioecology, and behavioral psychology to argue strongly for the power of stories. So the way in which we tell stories, for instance, about the past, makes a difference. And that is true of both inside and outside the classroom. I'll try and link that to some aspects of especially the Danish curriculum and to the way that museum exhibitions are designed. And in doing so, I will make an argument for stories that are relevant to the Anthropocene, but attuned to its deep time roots, so that we reflect on the future in light of the present, seen in light of the past, seen in the present. And in doing so, I will make an argument, drawing on some colleagues from DPU's work, for a kind of a dark pedagogy of what you could call, with Potter et al., shadow places in history and archaeology. And by highlighting the temporal dimensions of the Anthropocene that have roots that are deeper than modernity, I think we can reach for a better, more robust intergenerational dialogue, and ultimately for a healthier knowledge economy, both in the informal and formal education sector. Whilst a lot of my examples will be noir or even gloomy, I think ultimately there's also a message of hope here, and that is that as an archaeologist, as an historian, I can see that societal change is possible. It just doesn't happen overnight. It happens across generations, and that is precisely why education is so very important. So here are the three key pillars, the foundations of what I want to talk to you about today, and that is Dipesh Chakrabarty's writings on the climate of history. So his main thesis that we can no longer tell political history or economic history without also telling climate history. His later writings highlighting very strongly that capitalism and extractive economies are intimately intertwined with the emergence of the Anthropocene. And finally, that we need new conceptions of time to help us better understand how we ended up in our contemporary conundrums. So there are three main theses on which I would like to build this talk. In the Anthropocene, cultural and natural history collapse. Western extractive capitalism and consumerism are implicated in the wickedness of the Anthropocene, and new conceptions of time are needed to comprehend the entanglements of human and Earth history. From the 1950s onwards, there are many proxies, both natural scientific and socioeconomic or broader cultural, if you will, that allow us to track the great acceleration of the Anthropocene. And I just want to highlight some of them precisely because I would like to return to them later on specifically. So population increase, for instance, is strongly implicated in our current situation. Urban populations more so, water use, transportation. These are things that we can track as proxies for the great acceleration in tandem with the degradation of many ecosystem services, if you will. Keep the shape of these curves and some of these proxies in mind for later. But the roots of the Anthropocene go deeper than 1950. And if you read a little bit into the research literature around the Anthropocene, there is a great scientific and political, inevitably political debate about when precisely the Anthropocene should start. Should we really let it collapse into a singularity with modernity, setting 1950s as a shallow starting point for what is otherwise thought of as a geological epoch? Many folks are not entirely happy with that, highlighting that it ignores much of early human history and relegates it to irrelevance. Some would like the Anthropocene to start as early as 50,000 years ago, when people began extirpating essential components of past ecosystems, megafauna, fauna in particular, large animals. Had we not done that, had humans not done that, the world would look very different today. But in my presentation today, I'd like to highlight in particular two linked aspects, and that is the original farming and the later development of extensive farming, and the Industrial Revolution and its eventual pinnacle with nuclear weapon detonations around 1945 and in the years following that. But before we look at the concrete cases of how we look at, for instance, the origin of farming and its implications for the present, let's reflect on the entanglements of this historical perspective. This is one example of an old 18th century chart for how we think history, how we think also by implication archaeology. It is a history of empire. It is a history of essentialized notions of culture, of, essentially nations or people that are led by kings or rulers as the main agents that drive historical processes. It is also a linear history. It is a history of progress. It is a history that ultimately ends with, in a positive sense, usually white British males. It is a history in the service of capitalism and a history in the service of empire. And archaeology is very much linked to that. Here is, I think, a fabulous figure from a recent book by Mark Maslin, a geographer at University College London, who juxtaposes the broad brush of human history from our hunter-gatherer ancestors to consumer capitalism with the broad brush proxies of global environmental impact. And you see that through these different steps or stages of human deep history, our impact on the world has grown. This is, in that sense, a very trivial kind of insight, but it weighs heavily onto the present. And this is a kind of particular sort of a Danish interlude, but I use the Danish example really just as an exemplary rather than only an example. The patterns are pretty much the same in every other European country, I can assure you. But the Danish example is particularly relevant because professional archaeology and many of the concepts and conceptions that we still use were founded in Denmark. And the picture you see on the left is of a guy called Christian Thomsen, who was the first director of the National Museum in Denmark, and the guy who came up with the idea of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age as a progressive transition towards effectively the modern period. And the picture on the right is a kind of poster that you find in a very popular Danish archaeology magazine called Skalk. Those of you amongst the audience who are Danish probably know it. It is widely read, it is widely consumed by both children and adults. And this is the poster that you see in the back of every single issue, and you have done so since the foundation of that magazine in the 1960s or so. It is a linear history leading to the present from some kind of perceived ancestry. It is a national history. It alludes to what happens outside, but it doesn't really take it very seriously. The world out there, the natural world, is a kind of canvas on which cultural history unfolds itself. It is also a kind of conception, visual conception of history that writes itself into the old-fashioned way of thinking progress. So archaeology itself already works with key concepts that match the rather more critical perspective of Maslin. The Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age can be mapped onto our curve of global environmental impacts, as can other components of, for instance, Danish history. This is an image of one of the few colonial forts from the Danish colonial period, where they were happily engaged in mercantile capitalism here from Trankebar. And we also have great examples of early industrial capitalism. Carlsberg, you know it all, probably the world's best beer, but an emblem of early industrial capitalism. The curves you see on the right are from writings of Carlsberg Brewery's own history. And the success of the breweries effectively is an Anthropocene proxy. It correlates in its production and sale with the rise of populations globally and the rise of urban populations in Copenhagen in particular. So the curves on the right are exactly what you see in contemporary research papers searching for proxies of the great acceleration that reflect the expanding Anthropocene. So here we have a local history, but of course Carlsberg is not thought of today as an agent or even a causal agent of the Anthropocene, but rather as a great sponsor of culture, in fact. And despite what some parts of Danish society and politics would like to claim, there is not much going on in terms of a green transition. We are now faced with the two slopes at the end of this graph going up or down, ever more growth, ever more global environmental impact, or some form of de-acceleration. But we still consume a ton of meat. Agriculture is going strong in Denmark. Meat is being produced in inhumane conditions, and consumerism is rife. These pictures, of course, are the picture on the bottom is, of course, from before the pandemic, but people are simply gagging to go back to the shops. So personally, I don't think much is pointing in the right direction in relation to Maslin's graph. So where are we going? Which kind of climate projection are we going to see? These are the climate projections from the IPCC, and a lot of scientists agree that we're actually in the red sector rather than in any of the blue sectors. Urgent action is needed, and disciplines such as archaeology and history, as far as I can see it, do not really play their part at the moment towards these sustainability disciplines, the sustainability goals. And let me exemplify this by looking briefly at the way that we look at the origins and development of farming with an Anthropocene perspective. Farming developed in various parts of the globe. We have early examples in Papua New Guinea and in China, but classically, the farming development, the origins of farming that is most relevant for Europe happened in the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Near East, here in the Eastern Mediterranean. And from the humble beginnings of corn farming within what can be characterized as a broad spectrum economy, we see an expansive cultural development that really can only be described, or can appropriately be described, as a form of colonialism. So from the humble beginnings here, we see a rapid spread of farming economies that correlate with a demographic growth and effectively a land-taking ethic where indigenous populations in Europe are subsumed or wiped out by these incoming farming populations. We see an increase in warfare and territoriality, in social stratification, the emergence of political hierarchies, of social inequality, all correlating with even these early forms of farming. We see the massive modification of landscapes through burning. Again, this could also be a picture that we can relate to the burning of the Amazon, but we generally think about this as a period of cultural efflorescence, of positive developments, of the emergence of societies that are more akin to our own. Many people would think of these as their ancestors in very real senses. But of course, the end point of all of this is deforestation, is cruel agriculture, and is the massive transformation of landforms all over Europe. And in the classroom, this can look a little bit like this. It's of course a historic example, but many Danes, for instance, will recognize these images because they were common in especially primary schools until relatively recently. And they are tame, uncontroversial, conservative conceptions of what the past looked like in these agricultural societies, full of gender stereotypes, of white people, of an inactive landscape canvas. Climate change is not present. It is effectively a 20th century society projected into the past in what was then thought to be a natural way. But it does in no way bring out the controversies, the environmental impacts, the broad perspective on where the emergence and development of extensive agriculture has led us into in the present. So quickly on to the Industrial Revolution. We skip a few thousand years of cultural history and move to some of the sites that have been elevated to UNESCO World Heritage. Many of these are sites of industrial extraction. An early British example from the Iron Bridge Gorge. We have an example in Sweden of ore extraction, and many steelworks in Germany. One striking example is the Völklichen Ironworks, where the description on the UNESCO website elevates this to a synonym for and a symbol of human achievement. This, you don't have to do a sentiment analysis of these texts to realize that this is very, very positive engagement with a cultural heritage that is highly destructive and highly problematic seen in an Anthropocene context, not least because it is also these steelworks that really supplied the arms industry leading up to the Second World War, which in many ways was the culmination of the Industrial Revolution. And to bring this down to earth, let me take you to a very boring place in the middle of Denmark. This is an image from a landscape in the middle of Jutland, namely Søby. Søby is a former low-grade coal mine in the middle of Denmark. You see on the map here an entirely humanly modified landscapes. All these lakes are artificial. They are today poisonous. They are dangerous. The landscape is not fit for human use. And it was created in the years around the Second World War because the supply lines of coal were cut off from Britain. So in Denmark, low-grade coal had to be mined, mainly by hand, but also using early industrial machinery. But when you come to Søby today, you meet a lush and in many ways unassuming landscape. And moreover, you meet a small museum. It is a sort of an open-air museum, tidied for all controversy, tidied for all noise and stench. The living conditions in this place, we know when it was still active, were abysmal, but this is not an impression that you get. Instead, what you can get, the impression you can get from reading the publications about Søby, is that this was a Danish Klondike. It was an economic adventure that contributed to the growth of modern society. Aspects of domestic violence, of inequality, of exploitation are definitely not highlighted. Some of the richest people in Denmark today, their fortunes were partly founded on economic engagement at Søby. It is a very interesting, rich, and quite dark history that this place harbors. And some years ago, we decided to investigate this archaeologically. So we did field work at this landscape, which we knew was destroyed, was razed, was entirely reset in the 1950s. And we found lots of material that really are classic archaeological objects that you would find on any kind of dig. It is ceramics, it is iron, it is coins that allow for handy dating of the activity, and it's glass shards here with an old logo of the Bosch company, and we could source this. So we know it came from Germany, of course, and we know it came from a bicycle light. We also later found the bicycle. So there is an early history of personal transportation to be told here, of industrial development and distribution. But most importantly, we found evidence for the transition from an inherently local and inherently recyclable economy with this bottle top that came from no more than about 100 kilometers away from Cebu to a plastic economy. And plastic is the paragon item that embodies the shallow Anthropocene. And it's really interesting because plastic in itself is an insidious material. It requires fossil fuels to produce. It is made partly of fossil materials, and it is not designed for any form of reuse. It is entirely anonymous. This could come from anywhere, and that too is an aspect of the Anthropocene, rising global entanglements of production and consumption. So Cebu itself tells us another story when looked in the right way. And this is the story that we then chose to present at a, oh, sorry about that, at a museum exhibition at Moorskov Museum. Moorskov Museum is one of the most busily visited museums in Denmark. It has about 500,000 visitors a year. And this story, in this story we used the artifacts that we found to tell a story about the shadow places at Cebu, the alternative views, the dark histories that hide underneath the kind of polished perspective that you get from the official publications and the museum displays. It was an exhibition that invited critical thinking, that invited surprise, and that invited a personal engagement with the global entanglements of a local place such as Cebu. And museums are, I would argue, supremely important here. Let me briefly expand on this. There is a large literature out there on the role of museums in sustainability and climate change debates. Museums are very interesting places because they straddle the boundary between formal and informal places of education. They are commonly visited, for instance, by school classes as part of their curriculum. But they're also visited by people who are not engaged in formal education. They are also places of debate. People come to them often voluntarily, and they come with an inherent openness to learn and engage. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. However, the majority of writing about sustainability and climate change issues in museums comes from museums of natural history and technical museums, science museums. So once again, we have a replication of disciplinary divides where sustainability and climate change are perceived as issues and problems of the natural sciences or of engineering, the technological fix. But of course, in the Anthropocene, following Chakrabarty, those kind of boundaries collapse. We can no longer make that distinction. And moreover, museums of natural history are not the powerful agents of dialogue and education that museums of cultural history are. The data you see on the graph to the right on the slide comes from the Danish Statistics Office and covers the last 10 years or so. And besides the interesting general drop in visitor numbers, the pattern remains striking. The black bars are the number of visitors in natural history museums, and the white bars are the number of visitors in cultural history museums. And you can, the numbers speak for themselves. If we really want to engage people within a museum space with educational purposes in issues relating to the Anthropocene, then we should do so in museums of culture history. But as I've shown earlier, the majority of museums of culture history remain in the service of empire, remain in the service of a fundamentally capitalist history. They heed a usually linear development focusing on issues of economy, warfare, status. They are often nationally framed. Classically, in Europe, we have in every country a national museum founded and entangled very much in the emergence of contemporary nation states. But also most other museums see themselves as fundamentally engaged with telling a local or regional history, usually in a linear way. So currently, I would argue, many cultural history museums have not yet realized the inherent potential to participate and influence this debate. Yet, following the SDGs, we have heritage as a driver and enabler of sustainability. So there is a large potential to rethink cultural and natural heritage as linked and to rethink those in relation to the stories that we tell. So archaeology, history holds, you could say, old lessons. We know now that empires fall, that societies are responsive, susceptible, and even vulnerable to certain forms of climate change and environmental change. This is the story that the record tells us. But we need, I would argue, new pedagogies and new narratives to really bring these insights into the contemporary debate about education. And the angle of dark pedagogy developed by Lysgaard and Bengtsen is an interesting and fresh one that allows us to explore and tell stories about these shadow places, not to topple narratives, the old narratives entirely. And I'm also not arguing for an alternative Marxist history writing here. This isn't what it's about, but it's about alternative perspectives and about an explicit linkage of our narratives of the past to narratives about the future. And the inherent temporality of thinking historically then allows us to also frame this in terms of intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational change. So time can be reframed as generations. And if we look at how societal change occurred over generations, then we can also think better about how we might think about implementing the SDGs. Electoral cycles, or even the time frame set by the UN for these various goals, are, in a historical perspective, relatively short. And I realize, of course, action is urgently needed, but I think we have to also realize that a lot of these goals are not to be achieved over relatively short time spans. And ultimately, I think we need new alliances of disciplines, and we need to argue with and against, if necessary, our institutional structures to be breaking down the existing disciplinary boundaries so that we can create a healthier knowledge ecology that is operative both in primary, secondary, and tertiary education, for sure. We live in the world that we do, but change is possible if you take a historical perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation, Felix. Thank you so much. I will suggest now, we have approximately 10 minutes for questions and answers, and I would suggest that we use the chat so I can keep track of who is asking what when, and you can just write comment / question if you have a comment or a question. So write that in the chat and we will take it from there. Okay, good. Let's just see here if there's anyone here in the chat doing something here. Alternatively, anyone who have some questions? I will have a lot of questions, but I will see if someone else before. Yeah, Karen, you have a question. or comment. You are on.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to see if I can my okay. I'll start my video. Can you see me? No.
Now we can see you.
How are you? Okay. Yes, I found it really interesting as well. Also to the way you are presenting the development and the positions. However, I of course I find it interesting that you find that the solution is to kind of get rid of the boundaries. But why is it like that? Why is it that you think that this should and could be the solution?
I think there is an increasing necessity for, say, interdisciplinary research and interaction in the real world. But as far as I can see, our education systems, and this is primarily from a university perspective, they are very rigidly silotized into relatively old-fashioned disciplinary boundaries. And that is often with the argument that we need these to impart certain core skills to those who, say, study geology or archaeology or whatever. But those core skills are much more aligned with the kind of old-fashioned ways of thinking these disciplines that are really not in the service of a sustainability agenda. And there is no movement towards breaking those issues. So whilst we have a growing range of educational programs that are very explicitly focused on sustainability, this, I think, is an unhealthy partitioning of the notion of sustainability into small pockets, rather than rethinking it into simply every education.
Yes, I agree with you on that. And actually, if we see, it's right that I've studied the curriculum of the schools, the Danish schools, and if you see in the 2010s, there was much more. For example, every subject should be engaged in globalization and internationalization and sustainability. But in the recent curriculum, really the sustainability kind of is put into natural science subjects, and I agree with you on that. Partly, I guess it's also in a way what UNESCO has done. So it's also things that should be put on more overall agendas. But that's that was just one thing. And then, of course, why is it that education should solve these things? Maybe there should be just a lot of other things that could solve, and other persons and other organizations even.
Naturally, but I think intergenerational change over time is the key here. And education in any way, whether it's formal or informal, at home or outside, is a very important aspect here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I will check the chat continuously, but I also will take the opportunity to ask a question, and that's because you're inspired by this dark pedagogic by Jonas Lysgaard and Bengtsen, I think. And I would like to hear your take on it, because you also said, well, this 2030 goals, no, you did not say forget about, but you say it will be very, very difficult to achieve them all. And I was wondering, I remember in your abstract, you also wrote about hope. So how do you think, how do you think education should imagine various futures in a way? Because you could also say this could be an agenda for not doing anything at all, in a way, a nihilistic, well, it's all done now, so just leave it as it is. I said, have the best time of it. And the intergenerational thing, this is something UN and perhaps UNESCO had invented, but let's see what's happening. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about how to best communicate climate futures, whether it should be through doom and gloom or hope. I'm skeptical of overly optimistic messages, to be honest, because they are not evidence-based, I think, neither historically speaking, nor in any contemporary way. And I think we need to be realistic. But that also has an hopeful underside, right? So we can do things, we can mitigate. Change is possible, but it's not easy. And of course that leads us to ethical considerations. I mean, if you're a strict individualist, well, yeah, okay, then you can take whatever it means for you, right? But I mean, that I think would be a poor model for society of any kind. And the interesting, there's some really interesting psychological research, and of course this is admittedly in kind of controlled experimental settings, that suggests that action on environmental issues is actually more strongly catalyzed by negative narratives than by positive narratives. This would be an evidence-based argument for saying, well, you know, we shouldn't tell the hopeful stories, certainly not only, right? But I think it is about a balance, right? My drive personally is, you know, I research episodes where the environmental change and climate change has impacted human societies, and they get strongly impacted, and that has massive demographic and societal costs in terms of lives and livelihoods, and it happens again and again in the past, right? It's going to, I mean, if that suggests anything, it's going to happen again in the future. If we don't want that to happen in the ways that are ethically entirely unacceptable, we have to do something.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. This is this thing about hope, I think, is a big issue. How can you have it when given the circumstances, and how to go the educational normativity? I can see there is one question. I think a comment and a question. I think this will be the last one in this session, in this presentation. This is from Brady. Maybe you will take over here, Brady, and ask the question, the comment.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's a long way from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to where you are. So I've just tried to capture it's not so much a question, it's a little comment. It's about whether perhaps the very question of sustainability is engaged within each discipline as an apparatus for, well, sustainability provides the apparatus for interdisciplinarity. I'm cautious about losing disciplines, but the need to talk between them, I think sustainability could be the vehicle, could be within educational, but we struggle to integrate sustainability within our programs, and I'm thinking that this might be a way to do it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that will be very, very productive and maybe more practical. I mean, a disciplinary collapse is a sort of a hard and probably very, very difficult to implement suggestion. I just experience those boundaries so acutely every day, and see the big gap between what we do in research, which is undisciplined, and what we do in teaching, which is highly discipline specific. And I think we fail our students in preparing them for the problems of the real world by silotizing them within strongly disciplinary programs.
Yes.
But okay. Of course, this is very, yeah, sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, but there will be time. I can advertise there will be some breakout rooms after this sessions where people can meet if they want to. But for the time being, that's true. We have to keep strict to the timing here, being online, luckily. And thank you very much for this question, Brady, because I think this leads directly over to our second presenter, who is Kenneth Nordgren from Karlstad. He's a professor at Karlstad University in Sweden, and specialized exactly in subject didactics broadly, but also with a keen focus on history. So we will hear something about this. I think something along the same lines, but still a bit different, but the same discussion. So with this, I will leave the floor to you, Kenneth. So you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see if I can get this moving here. Okay. Can you see my presentation and you can hear me well? Very good. And I would like first to say thank you very much for being invited to take part in this fantastic conference. I'm looking very much forward to following the conference, and I hope I will learn a lot, because I've been working with subject didactics, and especially related to history for more than I can remember right now. But I'm quite new into the discussion about history and education in relation to what Felix had talked about the Anthropocene and how that affects teaching. So I'm engaging in this, I think, more in a explorative way, where I have a lot of questions that I would like to put out and think about. And I'm very much agreeing on what Felix just had talked about, but in some way I drew a bit of different conclusion, or at least in how to approach these difficulties that Felix has talked about. So in that way, I think that the combination of me and Felix hopefully will lead to a fruitful discussion, because my conclusion is that the disciplines are perhaps more important than ever. But saying that, I'm not at all ruling out the importance of working together or cross-disciplinary, cross-curricula in education. But the question is a more radical one, I would say, that as Felix discussed, that there is a problem within history education. They're following a sort of a methodological nationalism that doesn't function very well in addressing questions like interculturality, multiculturality, and definitely not the Anthropocene. But if we don't deal with the deep structures of the discipline, then we will combine different disciplines that haven't gone back and done their lesson to be more functional, related to what they are or should approach. So let's see here if I So you see my next slide here, yes. So what I'm trying to talk about today is first about what actually is a discipline. Understanding that disciplines are historical, changeable, but not arbitrary, and that the discipline has an effect on how we understand the object of learning. And if we ask new questions about the object of learning, that will eventually lead to affect the disciplines and the subjects, because there is an interrelation between what we are going to teach about and how the discipline and the subjects evolve. I will also try to put out some perhaps a bit counterintuitive results or ideas as well. First, the counterintuitive, my first counterintuitive thought is the idea that disciplines is perhaps more important, even though the Anthropocene is, of course, a question that you can't approach without having the input from different disciplines. Another perhaps intuitive idea here, thought, is that even though Anthropocene adds more questions, more narratives to understanding ourselves in a historical perspective, this perhaps also calls for a more radical outlook on what is history. Do we need new ideas of synthesis, which actually is new ideas of master narratives? And those master narratives is also affecting what is possible to organize, how we can organize the objects of learning. However, we also have, there is a danger of working with new master narratives because they are homogenizing. So we need alternative narratives, and we need also normative aspects related to this. And perhaps ideas of truthfulness, justice, and hope could be aspects of that sort of build in a contradiction or tensions within the synthesis in history education. So this I hopefully will have the time to address. So first, I would like to say that I think Bruno Latour's question sort of nailed this very much for us as educators. The problem for all of us is, how do we tell such a story? And the story is about the Anthropocene. And of course, I'm taking the Anthropocene as the point of departure. I will not go into it because I assume that you're all familiar with the concept, and also Felix did a great job of going through important aspects of this. But as teachers, we have to approach this idea. How do we tell such a complex story? And doing that, we have to stop and think about what is actually the problem here. Is the problem to explain the Anthropocene, or is the problem to learn how to live within the Anthropocene, or is the problem to stop or hinder the further evolution of climate change and so on? So what is actually the problem? And who are we? We are teachers, but does it matter if we are teachers in history or biology or geography or language? Does that matter? And what should we actually story? Should we story, and if I'm going to history, should we story how to understand again the idea of Anthropocene and how that evolved, or should we look back at the long, deep history as Felix talked about? And perhaps we need to do all of that. So if we go a little bit deeper into the problem, there is, of course, a great discussion stemming from Chakrabarty's splendid articles about natural history and human history collapsing into each other, indicating that we need a new kind of disciplinary thinking. So that is a problem relating to how we should approach the problem and how we should approach what we're storing. We can also understand it as also driving from Chakrabarty's discussion. We can understand this as a sort of a radical rewriting of our notion of what is historical significance, understanding Anthropocene as a radical game changer, but a game changer that is possible to relate to within the traditional borders of a historical approach? Or is it that the Anthropocene actually is counterproductive, that it conceals the inequalities between nation and classes, and the idea of a joint humanity is artificial? In some way, I would like to embrace all of these three standpoints, because I think there is an important tension between them. But going further in this, to make this possible in relation to history education, I myself would favor the middle idea here, but also seeing the importance of the other two. So if we go back to the idea of a discipline, and that's the question of who are we? Who am I talking? I'm talking now as a historian and history educators. And I'm doing that from the position of my disciplinary knowledge and my experience as a teacher. And both of them are related to the discipline of history. And we can, with the help of Bernstein, we can ask the question of what is an academic discipline? Yes, we can see it's a historical construction, it's changeable, but it's not arbitrary. It follows a logic of systematized knowledge. When we go deeper into things, when we learn about things, we construct concepts, we construct methods, we construct epistemic communities who can talk about these methods, about these concepts, about the quality of dealing with the concepts and methods. And that way of systematizing knowledge differs from other kind of knowledge, which is also important, like everyday knowledge. They have a different function, they have different methods, they are different in the way that they are socialized. In that way, we can understand the borders of a discipline as a tool to think counterintuitive thoughts, tools to beyond the immediate context. So in that way, disciplinary borders are tools to think the not yet thought. And another aspect of disciplines is that they differ. It's true that the world is more complex than the discipline. That is why the discipline have borders, have tools, because they need to dissect, search into aspects, because the whole of the world is too complex. And different subjects or different disciplines differs also. Bernstein talks about vertical and horizontal structures, like science is built on principles, about it's a paradigmatic way of evolving, where one theory excludes another theory. History doesn't function like that. You can have different kind of theories, different kind of ontological ideas that can actually live in the same seminar. They don't exclude each other, but they have anyway a grammar, a sort of way of thinking, of developing a historical gaze that you can develop as a historian. So that in that way, the discipline doesn't have the same approach to reality. Then there is the tensions that Felix talked about, that the logic from the disciplines also create epistemic communities that also functions as gatekeepers of traditions. If we start that the disciplinary borders are the logic of exploring the world, they also become the logic of what to explore, and can hinder the future development. And that's why I assume that Felix and Chakrabarti talks about we have to perhaps go beyond history education. But this I would like to say that I would welcome, and I don't mind such an evolution. But I would also like to think that the knowledge system differs, and they can combine, but they can't combine from researchers that is familiar with the different knowledge structures, because otherwise there won't be a mutual contribution. And one can also relate to Michael Young and the discussion of power for knowledge. He talks about this more in the relation of future, but I think that this is applicable here as well. He talks about a future one, which is called as the stance of a way of under socializing the epistemic of knowledge, where one thinks that what science and disciplines have developed their body of knowledge that is once and for all conquered, and that's there for us to learn, and that's a way of under socializing knowledge. He also talks about the future too, where we over socialize the idea of knowledge, where we only see the tensions, where we only see the negative aspects of the borders, while the future tree perhaps then should be the synthesized, or not the synthesized, but rather the idea of living with the tensions, seeing the tension as a sort of a necessary aspect of producing knowledge. So then, if we take this into the history, what should we study? What can history as a system of knowledge bring to our understanding of the Anthropocene situation? Here we ask this as teachers and curriculars. We have to ask the right question to the subject and to the discipline to change them some way. And if we talk about powerful knowledge, knowledge can be powerful if it's usable for the students to orient in the world they are living. So when we ask the question, what is it, or is there something that history can bring to the table for understanding the Anthropocene, for living in the Anthropocene, what could that be? That is the important question, I think, for us as a curricular thinkers. Is there something that historical gaze can add that other logics don't? That doesn't exclude the possibility of interaction, but it's a radical question, because that forces us to think, what is it actually that history, the way of the logic of history, or the logic of anthropology, or whatever, can bring to the question. And then there's the question of what is it we want to explain? Should we explain, use this to handle the crisis, explain the Anthropocene condition, learn to live the sustainable, or should we develop a new historical self-understanding, understanding history in the new normal? And of course, I think we have to do both. But if the first question looks to the future, the other one looks back at the history and ask ourselves how, as we already are in the Anthropocene, how shall we understand our historical self-understanding in this, and can history help us doing that, looking back? So in that way, I think that the second question is more radical, because that's the one that actually challenge the epistemological borders of the subject. So what we need to think about the subject, I think, is as a reciprocal or a hermeneutic development that could be possible, that is not necessarily possible. But the first in this very simple model here, we can say that I talked about the subject as a sort of a way to frame the logic of the knowledge is systematic. We have a historical grammar, we have the critical perspective, and we can, with the help of that, ask what from that is powerful to understand the phenomenon that we are looking at, in this case, the Anthropocene. And then we understand the Anthropocene as something that is understandable. Okay? But doing that, we will also see that Anthropocene is something that is unprecedented. This is a new experience. This is a new situation. So trying to explain the Anthropocene, to understand the Anthropocene in a historical way, will also start to rewriting the epistemological tradition, because it's exactly as Chakrabarty talks about it, it's challenged our understanding of time, it's challenging our understanding of historical agency, it's changing the understanding of historical context, and it's challenging the master narratives, the master traditions that the subject consists of. So in that case, we have to I think, stay within the subject to do this work. Then we have the question of the master narrative. What is happening when we are doing this reciprocal device? Do we need a sort of a new master narrative? And this is in history education. In history, this is a sort of a not a very popular subject, because mostly people say that's the wrong question to ask. What we actually need is more narratives. We have to open up for different narratives, not replace one master narrative with another one. But perhaps one could say that there is not a position without master narrative. And what is master narrative? And you can also, of course, ask the question of what is the role of the education and history education? Is it to reproduce master narrative, or is it to question them? And I think the answer to that is we have to do both. The Anthropocene, the idea of Anthropocene, the epoch of Anthropocene sort of comes with a grid for new narratives, for new master narratives, even perhaps, and we can see that there are. We talked about that this go to the idea of how we organize the temporality within history. So we can see that one aspect is to go to the long lines, where I think that I fully agree with Felix' presentation, that's a very important idea. We can see that the idea of the long degree is necessary to understand why we end up where we are. But there are also the specific circumstances that go to the colonialism, the industrialization, and perhaps even the post-war situation, to understand how Anthropocene differs, how it's unprecedented, how it is something different. And then we have another push, and that's toward the future. So one can say that we have three different pushes in time understanding, where all of these three pushes are uncomfortable for a historian, while the first one is more to archaeology and deep history, and the other one is highly political, and the third is the future. But to bring this into history education, it does something, or to be able to bring this into to history education, it does something with how we organize the basic of the idea of what we understand as historical significance. So let me take an example. At least in Sweden, all everyone who's becoming a history teacher and everyone else who reads history in university, I think reads Mackay, The History of World Societies, which is in many ways a great book. The way that the book starts off, the English, the revolution is the same way that we can see in most textbooks in schools. The Industrial Revolution began in England. It was something new in history, and it was quite unplanned. With no models to copy and no idea of what to expect, England had to pioneer not only in industrial technology, but also in social relation and urban living. Between 1793 and 1815, almost constant war with France complicated these formidable tasks. There's not anything historical wrong in this beginning, but the interesting is, why does Mackay and our history textbooks starts with the question, why did the Industrial Revolution start in England? Why is that a historical significant question? Well, it is logic related to the methodological nationalism, where we understand the nation as the bearer of historical developments. So we frame the questions within the nation. That doesn't mean that it has to be nationalistic. It means that we think of nations as the bearer of history and the relation between nations. So when we start with the old Sumerian civilization as the first civilization that students meet, they are already there as Sumerians, with their cities, with their I forgot what it's called now in English, but they are there, and they are and then we follow this ethno-national ideas from there to where the national states actually formates. So that's the logic of the history. When I was in US, I went to a museum close to Indianapolis, where there's an interesting museum about the indigenous people living in that area. And I took a picture of this where they talked about how the indigenous people traded. And the interesting aspect, as you can see here, this is based on an archaeological place from the 11th to the 15th century. And at that time, there was no map of US. The borders towards Canada was established, I think, around the beginning of 19, and towards Mexico in the 1850s, something like that. But for the museum, the idea of framing this within the idea of the national frame was sort of a default way of thinking about how history and things should be explained and understood. So what I'm saying here, that the master narrative isn't a single narrative. It is not a narrative that have a neat beginning, middle, and end. A master narrative is more scripts that helps us to orient, to connect different kind of narratives to larger understanding. The idea here from the idea of historical consciousness is that we need narratives to orient. in the world. We combine things to ideas of coherence and meaning. And history also need synthesis, probably, to get some sort of coherence. And the synthesis need idea of selection, principles for significance of what kind of agency, what kind of places, what kind of events is important. And that leads us to master narratives. But as I said, master narratives are also homogenizing, so they are also difficult to deal with, and one can't just produce a new master narrative for history, but we will come into that. But the idea from McLennan's side is that this quite simple figure is that we orient ourselves in the personal life to different kinds of narratives within our culture. And we orient the personal narratives are not themselves master narratives, but they relate to them, the idea of the culture. And they also relate to alternative narratives or counter narratives. They're also there. And the master narratives also relate to that. So the master narratives don't exclude alternative narratives. McLennan even says that alternative narratives doesn't seldom underpin or make the master narratives even stronger, because they constantly approach them, constantly make them visible. So master narrative can embrace a certain amount of alternative narratives. In some point, they will probably break, and they will develop a new master narrative. But we cannot assume or pretend that the master narratives are not there, or that adding alternative narratives will sort of conceal the master narratives. So going from there, one can say that the master narratives, or I can say like this, that to understand the history, from the deep history to the present, to allowing the nature, migration, cross-cultural encounters being a part of our deep understanding of what history is. That's why we need a master narrative that makes this a sort of a new default system of thinking about the Sumerians or the Industrial Revolution or whatever. But not as a single history, but as a logic. And perhaps also, we also need to approach the Anthropocene. We also have to relate to some idea of what can consist this master narrative, but what can also challenge it. The German historian and philosopher John Rüsen, he talks about that history has to approach the idea of human dignity as the center of historical understanding. And I can see that, but I can also see that relating this to the Anthropocene, it's a bit too anthropocentric, and perhaps it doesn't get the challenges that are out there. So I'm thinking now of trying to think with the philosopher of Byron Wilson, who is drawing from the Aristotelian virtues. He's talking about truthfulness, justice, and hope, and I will in 3 minutes go through them. First, truthfulness. I would say that there are at least two aspects of this. The first is to understand how scientific evidence works as the best accessible knowledge, where everything put out there is not as good knowledge as other knowledge. There are better knowledge relating to certain kind of knowledge that we want to achieve, or way of explaining the world. But at the same time, we need tools to deconstruct knowledge regimes that are obsolete. So we have also the idea of truthfulness is also to learn a sort of a hermeneutics of suspicion, as the master narrative or the narrative orientation that I talked about is a part of our what we do with the scientific evidence and so on. Another way is the justice, and that draws in the problematization of that humanity is not equally guilty, or not equally have the same resources to deal with the Anthropocene condition. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to in history we have to research that and find it. And in this way, and as I understand it, Anthropocene is a challenge both to traditional understanding of history and critical, in the way that it forces us to deal with both the specific and the universal aspects of history. The last idea of hope here is the importance of hope. But in these cases, I understand, Winston, it's not as much as telling a hopeful or story that we can learn from. The hope is more a way of doing things, informed action, or what we can call it, the responsibility to use the knowledge to deal with the world, because the hope is not, in this case, within the story, but more in the way how we take the story into life and deal with the life. Yeah. So there was my time up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you. It was again a really interesting presentation, and I think the two presentations work neatly together. Again, I would like people to write in the chat saying comments or questions or both. So that's a Q&A now. So everybody, or yeah, so this is how if somebody wants to start writing a question, then it's now. Yes, Felix. Oh, that's good. We have a conversation between our two presenters.
Sorry. But it is a question for Kenneth.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. It was really, really great and inspiring presentation. I was wondering whether you know of any existing, say, textbooks, alternatives to the ones that you mentioned, that are going in direction of that you've been sketching out.
Yeah. Yes, not textbooks so much as digital sites. So there is. I would suggest the big history sites. I don't know if are you familiar with that, Felix? Bob Bain and other that I wouldn't see that as a perfect example of what I'm talking about, but they are putting up lessons where they are dealing with those questions that makes us, I think, can see the contours of a new way of narrate the big history. And there are also other that kind of digital examples, but in history, I think that they are. Yeah, I stopped. I don't have a very good.
That's fine.
Okay, other questions? Otherwise, I will ask a question. And this is, now we have a session with the two of you. I have a question actually, which is from both of you, because there is a notion of narrative, both in Felix's presentation and also in Kenneth's presentation. And I know we also have people here doing literature in this session here. So I was thinking a little bit, how to, one of the things in much modern thinking, also some of the thinkers dealing with the Anthropocene, is a distinction between kind of the virtual and the actual. So there is also, you could say, how do you understand narratives in relation to history? That's actually a question to both of you in relation to this distinction between the virtual and the actual, and literature for that matter.
You have to go first, Felix.
I can do. I would answer that they are contiguous, in the sense that, you know, social history perspectives on disciplines such as archaeology and history suggest that, you know, we write history in light of our own position in the present anyway, right? So also history, although constrained by, you know, facts and empirical record, and I think that is super important, but also history, also archaeology is to some degree fictive and virtual. So there is a sliding scale from writing about the past to writing about the future. And I think there's a lot of really interesting thinking and theorizing also, especially in relation to science fiction, that in fact also makes that point, right? And you could also highlight like nice salient details, like the fact that Ursula Le Guin is actually the daughter of a really famous American archaeologist. So her upbringing steeped in the past has given her the tools and the concepts of writing about the future in ways that are not so dissimilar from writing about the past.
Okay. Hey, yeah, you can.
I think that there's no escape from from narratives. I think that, as I talked about, a way of understanding the world in itself has a distinct narrative way in itself. So I wouldn't say that historical narratives is a defect in history, and I don't think it makes it less knowledgeable or so on, but it makes it difficult. And I also would like to say that I think that dealing with these kind of difficult questions relating to the Anthropocene and what that does with our historical self-understanding, I would also say that I think that interdisciplinary approach that I'm quite interested in is the relation between history and literature, actually, because I think that history and literature are different, but I think that the literature narratives helps us think of the complexity of being human in a way that the historical narrative doesn't always do. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Nobel laureate, Swedish Nobel laureate Harry Martinson, who wrote a piece in the 1950s called The Aniara, who is a sort of science fiction story about humans leaving the Earth in the 1950s because of the nuclear disasters and environmental destruction, and they are taking off in this rocket towards Mars, I think, and in some way it comes out of course and it breaks, so it just goes up out in the space with no hope. And I try to be short here, but but the interesting thing there is when people are starting to realize that there are no hope, they're just vanishing out deep space. There's a period of nostalgia where they're looking back and trying to remember the Earth. And from there, I think it goes over to a sort of drinking and partying and forgetting about everything. And that goes over to a sort of a more religious fundamentalist position where they're trying to be right because then perhaps someone would save them. And then there's the apathy where they just lay down. So I think that those kind of stories, they're not historical, but they using that in history education, it helps us think about how the future is a sort of a device, there are narrative device for our historical understanding. I don't know if this was an answer for your question, but
yeah, I think there's really interesting connections between literature and history, and not and archaeology for that matter. Not to make them the same, but the narrative is around them, and I think the two presentations in this session has really showed this. Now, actually, we have a little problem with our timer, so we actually a little bit behind schedule, but nothing serious. So we are actually, the session has ended.